It is the middle of July, 1895, and the air inside this cramped, windowless cellar in Toronto is thick, rancid, and honestly, practically suffocating.
Right, and Detective Frank Geyer is standing down there in the pitch black, with the dirt floor beneath his boots, just uneven and damp.
He has been tracking what is essentially a literal ghost across two countries, following this agonizingly sad trail of letters, and every single clue has led him to this miserable, dark little basement on St. Vincent Street.
So he takes a heavy iron spade and he forces it into the soft earth. He goes down about a foot, and suddenly this horrible, undeniable stench just rises up. It hits him violently in the back of the throat.
Yeah, it is the unmistakable smell of human decomposition.
Yeah.
But he refuses to stop. He keeps digging, plunging the shovel into the muck until the steel suddenly scrapes against something hard.
He reaches down into the wet dirt, his fingers brushing against something smooth, and he pulls it out.
It is the bone of a human forearm. And in that precise, terrifying second, the true, horrifying scale of America's most notorious swindler is finally unearthed.
It's absolute chilling.
I have to cut in right here, because if you think finding a victim buried in a secret basement is wild, you absolutely have to stick around until the end of the show to hear the unbelievable resolution to this discovery and the bizarre, frankly disgusting thing they pulled out of his own flooded grave a century later. We are Mike and Abby, and welcome to Wild Crime Podcasts. We are officially done with boring, slow-burn true crime. We're tearing into the most baffling cases on Earth, untangling the lies and dropping you right in the middle of the madness.
Whether you are on a long drive, crushing a workout, or just feeling a little bored, we are here to walk you through the mystery and make your next hour incredibly thrilling.
So we have an absolute mountain of sources today. We are pulling from late 19th century forensic reports, personal letters, private detective logs, and even modern 2017 exhumation data from the Penn Museum.
Right, and the mission here is to completely dissect Herman Webster Mudgett, the guy the world knows as H.H. Holmes. We really need to separate the sensationalized myths of his so-called murder castle from the gritty, terrifying historical reality of his greed and his instrumental violence.
Yeah, that separation is crucial, because that architectural monster stuff is wild, but it completely overshadows the real story.
Exactly. And before he was this mythical boogeyman in Chicago, he was just a terrified kid in New Hampshire who experienced this brutal sensory shock that completely warped his brain.
Okay, so we start in 1861, Yeomanton, New Hampshire. He is born into this incredibly strict, severely abusive Methodist family.
Yeah, his father is an alcoholic who regularly beats the kids, and Herman is an unusually intelligent boy, which, in a rough rural farming town in the 1860s, that instantly puts a massive target on his back.
Right, so he gets severely bullied, constantly. But there is one pivotal incident that always comes up in his psychological profile.
Right, the doctor's office.
Yes. A group of older, aggressive bullies dragged this terrified kid into a local doctor's office. They physically forced him against a wall, and they pressed his hands over the face of a real human skeleton, basically trying to scare the life out of him.
And this is where we really need to pause and look at his mental state, because it's so easy to draw a straight line there, right?
Well, wait, hold on. If we are looking at this from a psychological perspective, isn't that literally the definition of a traumatizing origin story? I mean, being physically assaulted and having your hands shoved onto a human skull as a kid, doesn't that validate the whole traumatized villain narrative? It seems like they literally forced him into becoming a monster.
I get why you'd say that, but clinical psychology tells a very different story. Being bullied with a skeleton does not forcefully rewire a healthy brain into a killer.
So what was it then?
What we are dealing with here is a primary psychopath, and a primary psychopath is someone who is born with a distinct biological deficit in the amygdala. They literally lack the neurological hardware to process empathy, guilt, or normal human fear.
Oh, wow. So it's biological, not just behavioral.
Exactly. Secondary psychopathy, or sociopathy, that's created by severe trauma. But Holmes was primary, so when those kids pushed him into the skeleton, he didn't experience lasting trauma. He experienced an awakening.
An awakening. That is incredibly unsettling.
It is, because instead of remaining paralyzed by fear, he realized the skeleton could not hurt him. It was just an object, calcium and bone. And that realization sparked this bizarre fascination.
Yeah, you almost immediately started capturing and dissecting small animals in the woods, right?
Right. He learned early on that flesh and bone were just materials to be manipulated, which perfectly sets the stage for what happens next.
Totally. By 1882, he is enrolled at the University of Michigan Medical School.
Hmm.
And the jump from dissecting animals in the woods to what he does at Michigan is staggering.
It really is, because at this university, under the instruction of a Professor William James Herdman, Holmes gets deeply, fundamentally involved in the black market of body snatching.
Which just sounds so crazy for a prestigious university.
Well, we really need to understand the mechanics of the 19th century medical world to grasp how this happened.
Mm.
In the 1880s, medical schools were expanding rapidly. Anatomy classes required a massive supply of human cadavers.
But legally, they were only allowed to use the bodies of executed criminals.
Exactly, which was nowhere near enough. So the University of Michigan operated on a very strict, highly corrupt, no questions asked policy. They essentially employed resurrection men, literal grave robbers, to supply their dissection tables.
So the university is actively funding a criminal enterprise just to keep their classes running.
Completely. They were paying top dollar for fresh bodies, and Holmes quickly figured out how to exploit this system. He realized that in the eyes of the medical establishment, human bodies were nothing more than commodities. They had a literal cash value.
It's just so grim.
It is. He learned he could steal a cadaver from the university's own supply, completely disfigure the face so it was unrecognizable, and then use it to defraud life insurance companies.
I need to pause and process the logistics of that because it's absolutely infuriating. You have a medical institution, a place supposed to be teaching healing, basically handing a primary psychopath a fully funded training ground for predatory behavior.
Oh, 100%.
They turned a blind eye to grave robbing just because it suited their curriculum. In doing so, they taught a budding killer how to completely dismantle a human being without leaving a trace, and how to monetize a corpse. It's a catastrophic failure of oversight.
It's a massive institutional failure, but it also highlights the specific mechanics of his crimes. I mean, how do you commit insurance fraud with a stolen body in 1882?
Right, because there's no DNA testing.
Exactly. No DNA, no dental records being cross-referenced in a national database. Identification was entirely visual.
So if a body was severely burned or disfigured, the insurance investigator just had to rely heavily on the testimony of a grieving family member or associate to identify the remains, like based on clothing or supposed birthmark.
And Holmes learned exactly how to manipulate those investigators. He is basically practicing his con game on them.
It's like a corrupt Wall Street internship. He's not some mad scientist trying to conquer death. He's an accountant of human lives. He realizes he can trade human bodies like stocks. He treats death as a mere business transaction, balancing his financial books with stolen bones.
That framing is so crucial. His actions were never driven by some grand, theatrical, supervillain logic. They were driven by a desperate, pathetic need for control and financial gain, and just massive hubris.
Yeah, he really thought he was untouchable.
He did, but that arrogance in medical school is nothing. Because that medical fraud alone is wild, but it pales in comparison to the massive, deadly maze he was about to build on an empty lot in Chicago.
Okay, so we are jumping to Chicago around 1885 or 1886. Holmes arrives in the city and eventually takes over a pharmacy at the corner of 63rd and Wallace Streets in the Inglewood neighborhood.
And right off the bat, we have to aggressively debunk a massive piece of true crime lore.
Yes, the Mrs. Holton myth. Tabloids have claimed for over a century that Holmes murdered the original owner of the pharmacy, an elderly woman named Mrs. Holton, and just stole her business.
Right. The classic sensationalized story is that she just vanished one afternoon, and Holmes stood behind the counter telling everyone she spontaneously moved to California.
Except when you actually look at the historical census records and property deeds, Elizabeth Holton lived well into the 20th century.
She really did.
She didn't vanish. She just sold at the store and moved a few blocks away. It is wild how easily a complete lie becomes concrete historical fact just because it sounds spooky.
And that specific misinformation campaign really sets the stage for the building he constructed across the street. Between 1889 and 1891, he builds this massive three-story structure.
150 feet long, 50 feet wide. The first floor is strictly retail storefronts, and the third floor contains relatively normal apartments.
But it's the second floor and the basement that gave it the tabloid nickname, the Murder Castle. If you read the Hearst newspapers from the 1890s, they claim this building was an elaborate, terrifying World's Fair hotel.
Right, filled with secret gas chambers, hidden trapdoor chutes, vats of acid, and a basement kiln capable of completely liquefying human bone at 3,000 degrees.
But when we dive into the rigorous, modern research of historian Adam Seltzer, a very different, much more pathetic picture emerges.
It really does.
Because this building rarely, if ever, functioned as a legitimate hotel for World's Fair tourists. Those hidden rooms, the bizarre winding hallways that led to nowhere, the doors that opened to brick walls, they were primarily designed to hide stolen furniture and building supplies from creditors.
Wait, so the maze wasn't to confuse victims. It was to hide couches.
Precisely. The mechanics of his business were built on rampant fraud. He would buy expensive material lumber, safes, massive pieces of furniture on credit. When the delivery men dropped it off, Holmes would immediately move it into one of these hidden windowless rooms. When the bill collectors came knocking weeks later, he would simply throw his hands up and claim the items had been stolen by thieves, completely refusing to pay.
So the bizarre layout was just a physical manifestation of his financial shell game.
Exactly.
And what about the confusing construction itself? The legend says he fired workers constantly so no one would know the secret layout of the murder rooms.
He did fire workers constantly, sometimes after only 2 or 3 days on the job. But again, the motive wasn't some evil master plan to keep secrets. It was because he didn't want to pay their wages.
Unbelievable.
If he fired a carpenter on Wednesday claiming the work was shoddy, he didn't have to pay him for Monday and Tuesday. The confusing, chaotic layout of the second floor was just a byproduct of 100 different unpaid, disconnected crews building random walls without a cohesive blueprint.
I love that analogy. It's less like a sophisticated villain's lair and much more like a deadly brick-and-mortar Ponzi scheme. He's robbing Peter to pay Paul with physical lumber and unpaid labor.
That's a perfect way to look at it.
It was built entirely on bad checks, unpaid bills, and constant erratic improvisation. He was a highly disorganized fraud, not a brilliant master architect.
That disorganized chaos is exactly how he operated day to day. But, we absolutely cannot diminish the lethal danger of that building because he did murder people there.
No, absolutely. But the actual confirmed victim count is around 9 people, not the 200 that the sensational tabloids later claimed just to sell papers.
Right, and the confirmed victims were not random tourists looking for a room. They were almost entirely women who worked for him in the pharmacy, women he manipulated into having affairs with him, or business associates he was actively swindling.
We're talking about specific, tragic lives here. Julia Connor and her 6-year-old daughter, Pearl. Emmeline Sigrand, Minnie and Nanny Williams. These were people deeply entangled in his financial web.
And he used the specific socioeconomic environment of Chicago to his advantage. In 1893, Chicago was exploding in population because of the world's Columbian Exposition.
The White City.
Yes, the White City was drawing millions of visitors. Young people, especially women, were moving from rural towns to the city in unprecedented numbers, looking for independence and factory work.
And you had a completely decentralized, highly corrupt Chicago police force that was heavily focused on protecting political appointments rather than, investigating missing young women.
So he's essentially hunting in an overcrowded, chaotic ecosystem where disappearing is completely normal.
Exactly. Holmes operated with impunity because the city was fundamentally overwhelmed. Millions of transients were moving through the rail stations daily.
If a young woman working at a pharmacy stopped writing letters home, her family in rural Indiana just assumed she moved on to a different city or got married. There was literally no infrastructure to track them.
If you're watching on YouTube right now, drop a comment. Would you have noticed these red flags? Or would the utter chaos of the 1893 World's Fair, with all the massive crowds, the blinding new electric lights, and the noise, have distracted you completely from a shady pharmacist offering you a seemingly great job?
It's a great question because these women weren't foolish. They were desperate for economic opportunity.
Right, and they walked right past the warning signs because society told them this was the city of dreams.
And honestly, Holmes could have kept swindling Chicago creditors and murdering his associates from that chaotic building forever. But his own staggering arrogance led him into a remarkably sloppy $10,000 insurance scam that would ultimately doom him.
We're heading into early 1894, and this is where his absolute hubris destroys his entire operation.
He really brings it on himself.
The Chicago creditors are finally closing in. He has so many lawsuits pending that he can barely walk down the street. He's even facing serious arson charges because he actually tried to burn the top floor of his own castle just to collect the property insurance.
Which is just so brazen.
So he realizes Chicago's too hot, and he flees. And he teams up with his closest associate, a carpenter and fellow criminal named Benjamin Pitezel.
Now, Pitezel is a fascinating figure in this story. He was basically Holmes's right-hand man. He helped build the confusing walls in the castle, he helped run the various shell companies, and he knew exactly where the bodies were buried, both figuratively and literally.
So they flee to Philadelphia
Hmm.
and hatch a plan to rip off the Fidelity Mutual Life Association.
And the plan sounds incredibly simple on paper, right?
Oh, yeah. Holmes will take out a massive $10,000 life insurance policy on Pitezel. They will find a cadaver on the black market that vaguely matches Pitezel's height and hair color.
Right.
They will disfigure the cadaver's face using a fake chemical explosion, claim the insurance money, and then split the cash while Pitezel goes into hiding.
Which is the exact same scam Holmes learned to pull 12 years earlier back in medical school. He knows the mechanics of the fraud intimately.
But this time it's different.
Very different. Only this time, the execution goes horrifically, brutally wrong. In September 1894, instead of going through the tedious trouble of locating a matching cadaver, transporting it, and staging the scene, Holmes makes a shockingly cold pivot.
He just decides to murder his actual partner.
Yes, he literally uses his only friend as the medical specimen. He knocks Pitezel out, completely saturates his face and chest with chloroform, and sets his living, breathing partner on fire to simulate a lab explosion.
That is just so incredibly dark.
It is the ultimate display of what forensic psychologists call instrumental violence. There is no passion in it. It's just a math problem to him. Why buy a fake body when the real one is sitting right in front of you?
But we'll get to the psychological fallout of that in a second. But first, you have to hear the lie that eventually unravels his entire life, which actually started a few months prior in a dirty St. Louis jail cell.
Oh, this part is just baffling.
Right, because earlier that year, Holmes was locked up briefly in St. Louis for a completely unrelated, ridiculous horse swindle. While he is sitting in this holding cell, he meets a notorious Wild West train robber named Marion Hedgepeth.
A literal train robber.
Yes. And Holmes, being the raging narcissist that he is, starts bragging to this hardened outlaw about his upcoming massive insurance scam with Pitezel. He asks Hedgepeth to recommend a corrupt, reliable lawyer on the outside who can help smoothly process the fake death paperwork.
And what does he offer him?
Holmes promises to pay Hedgepeth a $500 finder's fee for the lawyer's name.
So Hedgepeth gives him the name, Holmes gets out, goes to Philadelphia, murders Pitezel, and successfully collects the $10,000 from Fidelity Mutual. And then he never pays Hedgepeth the $500.
It is so incredibly stupid. I'm genuinely exasperated reading the historical logs on this.
It makes no sense.
You just pull off a massive, highly illegal $10,000 murder fraud. The cops are clueless, the insurance company paid out, and you decide to stiff a literal gun-toting train robber over $500.
It's pathological cheapness.
It's insane. Hedgepeth is sitting in his prison cell reading the daily newspaper, and he sees a small article stating that the Pitezel insurance claim paid out in Philadelphia. He instantly realizes he got completely screwed over by this smooth-talking pharmacist.
So what does a betrayed outlaw do?
He immediately calls the prison warden over to his cell and snitches on the entire operation. That single act of ridiculous, petty cheapness brings the Pinkerton National Detective Agency crashing down on Holmes's entire life.
It perfectly exposes the fundamental fatal flaw in his primary psychopathy. He genuinely believed he was so vastly superior to everyone else that his actions did not have consequences.
He really thought he was untouchable.
He thought Marion Hedgepeth was a dumb brute, entirely beneath him, incapable of causing him harm. That betrayal was cold and calculated. But the geographical shadow play we're about to enter next is pure, unfathomable evil.
I want to prepare everyone because this brings us to the darkest, most twisted road trip in American history.
It's really hard to stomach.
After killing Ben Pitezel in Philadelphia, Holmes realizes he has a massive, immediate problem. Pitezel's widow, Carrie, knows about the insurance scam.
Right, she was in on the fraud part of it.
Yes. She fully believes the body found in the Philadelphia lab was a stolen cadaver and that her husband Ben is currently hiding out somewhere waiting for the money. Holmes desperately needs to keep her quiet and compliant so she doesn't accidentally tip off the police.
So what does he do?
He convinces Carrie to let him take custody of 3 of her 5 children, 13-year-old Alice, 9-year-old Nellie, and 7-year-old Howard. He looks this grieving mother in the eye and tells her he is taking the kids on a train to secretly reunite them with their father.
And this creates a timeline anomaly that FBI forensic profilers still analyze in training classes today. By October 1894, Holmes is simultaneously managing 3 entirely separate groups of people, moving them constantly by train across the United States and Canada.
It's just staggering to think about the logistics.
Group 1 is his legal, oblivious wife, Georgiana. Group 2 is the widow, Carrie Pitezel, and her remaining 2 children. Group 3 is the 3 isolated kids, Alice, Nellie, and Howard.
He's moving them through Detroit, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and eventually Toronto. And he's doing it so incredibly carefully that none of these 3 groups have any idea the others are in the exact same city.
We are talking about him booking 3 different boarding houses within miles of each other.
He is lying to his wife about having late-night business meetings. He is lying to Carrie, telling her the kids are safe in a different state. And he is lying to these 3 terrified kids, telling them their mother is sick and can't see them.
We really need to stop and analyze the deeply flawed, horrific logic of this road trip, because from a purely criminal survival standpoint, it makes 0 sense.
None at all.
Why not just kill the mother and all the kids immediately in Philadelphia? Why drag 3 highly visible children across international borders for weeks on end, buying train tickets, checking into hotels, risking exposure every single day?
It is the psychology of the con. He isn't just killing to silence them. He's doing it because he loves the game.
Precisely.
Yeah.
He enjoyed the manipulative thrill. He was a predator, aggressively playing with his food.
Keeping those 3 groups separated had to be exhausting.
Oh, the amount of lies and logistical coordination required is almost superhuman. How do you remember which lie you told to the widow versus the lie you told your wife?
You'd slip up eventually.
He did it because he got a profound narcotic psychological high from controlling their perceived realities. He genuinely believed his intellect was so godlike that he could juggle 3 separate universes on trains across the continent without dropping a single ball.
But the reality of that juggling act is incredibly grim, because the facade eventually starts to crack under the weight of its own logistics.
Right.
In Indianapolis, right around mid-October, his mask slips. He visits a local pharmacy to buy a heavy, lethal cocktail of drugs. Then he stops at a local hardware repair shop and literally orders the clerk to sharpen his surgical knives.
And shortly after that errand, little 7-year-old Howard is murdered, dismembered, and burned in the chimney of a rental house.
It's just horrific.
And he doesn't stop. He takes the 2 remaining girls, Alice and Nellie, across the border to Toronto. He rents a small, nondescript house on St. Vincent Street.
It was where Geyer ends up.
Exactly. He forces both of these terrified girls into a large wooden trunk. He locks the lid shut, pulls out a hand drill, bores a hole straight into the wood, and connects a rubber gas hose to the city line. He asphyxiates them in the dark inside that trunk.
I know half of you driving right now are gripping the steering wheel, screaming at your podcast app, wondering why the hell nobody called the cops when this weird guy started moving 3 kids across state lines without their parents. I totally get it. It is infuriating to hear.
It really is.
But you have to put yourself in the mindset of 1894. There were no digital footprints. There were no Amber Alerts pinging on cell phones. He was using a dozen different aliases, checking into transient, cash-only boarding houses where clerks deliberately didn't ask questions.
Society was highly segmented, and people strictly minded their own business. If a well-dressed man said they were his nieces, you nodded and handed him the key.
He weaponized the anonymity of the era. He really thought he was an absolute ghost.
But his narcissism caused him to make a critical error. He left behind a massive, heartbreaking paper trail that a relentless Philadelphia detective was about to follow straight to his door.
Right, because while Holmes thinks he's a phantom, the Pinkertons and the insurance company are still actively hunting him for the $10,000 fraud.
They haven't forgotten about that.
They finally catch up to him on November 17, 1894, in Boston. But here's the crazy part that shows how disjointed law enforcement was back then.
Yeah.
They arrest him under one of his aliases, H.M. Howell, and they only arrest him for the outstanding Texas horse theft warrant and the Pitezel insurance fraud. They have absolutely no idea he is a serial killer. They don't know about the children. They just think he's a scam artist.
And Holmes, sitting in custody, realizes his control is slipping, so he starts spinning a dizzying, frantic web of lies to confuse the investigators.
He just can't stop lying.
He sits in the interrogation room and calmly tells the police that Ben Pitezel wasn't murdered at all. He claims Ben is actually alive and currently hiding out in South America. The next day, he changes his story entirely and says, no, Pitezel is actually in England.
And what about the kids?
Then he claims the 3 missing kids are safely traveling with a wealthy female associate in Europe.
His desperation for control gets so bad that he actually tries to bribe the guard watching his holding cell. He looks at this Boston cop and offers the guy $500 if the guard will just sit down and let Holmes hypnotize him so he could escape.
I mean, obviously the guard tells him to go to hell, but think about the sheer delusion required to even attempt that.
It's staggering. But the authorities know he is lying about the insurance, and Carrie Pitezel is absolutely frantic.
She has finally realized she's been played, and she hasn't seen her 3 children in months. The Fidelity Mutual Life Association starts to realize there is a much darker, much more violent crime hidden beneath the financial fraud.
So the Philadelphia Police Department formally assigns Detective Frank Geyer to figure out exactly what happened to Alice, Nellie, and Howard.
And I just marvel at the stark contrast between these two men. It's incredible.
It really is. You have Holmes, who is this erratic, overconfident improviser, a guy who thinks he can literally hypnotize his way out of a brick jail cell.
Right.
And then you have Detective Geyer, who is just this methodical, relentless, exhausted bloodhound. It is like watching a sloppy, arrogant illusionist get completely, systematically dismantled by a ruthless IRS auditor.
That's brilliant. And Geyer's methodology is exactly what breaks the case. He starts his search in the summer of 1895, and his biggest break comes from Holmes's own bizarre hoarding behavior.
Oh, the letters.
Yes. When Holmes was arrested in Boston, police searched his belongings and found a hidden collection of letters. They were letters written by Alice and Nellie during the road trip, begging their mother to come find them, asking why she wasn't writing back.
Because Holmes had told the girls he was mailing them, but he kept every single one.
Exactly. Geyer takes these unsent letters and uses the hotel names, the specific stationery, and the city postmarks mentioned in the text to retrace Holmes's exact route through the Midwest and into Canada.
Geyer is literally taking the trains, getting off at these cities, and going door to door. He is holding up worn photographs of Holmes and the kids, showing them to hotel clerks, carriage drivers, and landlords.
It's painstaking work.
He hits dead ends in Cincinnati. He hits dead ends in Detroit, but he keeps pushing. And finally, in Toronto, the dam breaks.
A neighbor remembers a man matching Holmes's distinct description renting a house on St. Vincent Street.
And the neighbor specifically recalls the man borrowing a heavy iron spade, claiming he needed to dig a hole for potatoes in the cellar.
Which brings us right back to the beginning of the story. Geyer goes down into that cellar. The smell hits him. He digs, and he finds the bone.
The sheer horror of that moment is recorded in Geyer's own logs. It wasn't until 7:30 in the evening that the local coroner finally arrived with proper equipment to fully process the scene.
They carefully excavated the dirt and found the 2 girls buried barely 3 feet deep.
It was a devastating, crushing discovery for Geyer. But he didn't stop. He knew Howard was still missing.
So he followed the trail of letters backward to Indianapolis, tracked down the rental cottage Holmes had used, and systematically dismantled the chimney flue.
And that's where he pulled Howard's charred teeth, bits of bone, and a piece of the boy's toy out of the soot. That was the hard, undeniable forensic proof that H.H. Holmes was not just a white-collar swindler, but a brutal, calculating child killer.
And that physical evidence is what sealed his fate in court. They didn't even need to prosecute him for the victims in the Chicago murder castle. The murder of Ben Pitezel and the subsequent trail of dead children was more than enough to secure a conviction.
But his bizarre story did not end when the trapdoor swung open on the gallows. It ended over 120 years later at the bottom of a flooded concrete grave.
Yeah, the end of this story is just as weird as the beginning.
So we jump to May 7, 1896. Holmes is taken to the gallows at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. He is completely calm, still lying, claiming he only killed 2 people.
Typical narcissist to the very end.
And even at the very end, the execution is horribly botched. When the trapdoor opens, the drop does not cleanly snap his neck. He hangs there, slowly strangling at the end of the rope for over 15 agonizing minutes before the prison doctors finally pronounce him dead.
And here's the ultimate bitter irony of his death. This guy, who spent his entire adult life stealing bodies from graves, stripping them of their flesh, and selling their skeletons for profit to medical schools, was absolutely terrified of being dissected himself.
It's amazing how hypocritical he was.
He knew exactly what happened to unclaimed bodies or executed criminals on the autopsy table, and he dreaded it, so he begged the prison officials to protect his corpse.
He specifically requested that his wooden coffin be placed inside a massive secondary box, entirely encased in solid cement, and buried 10 feet deep in the earth so no medical students could ever dig him up.
Which the prison actually allowed. They poured the concrete. But because Holmes had spun such a wealth of lies during his trial, almost immediately after his death, the rumors started flying.
Oh, the tabloids went wild. They claimed the man hanged that day was a decoy cadaver. They said Holmes bribed the prison guards with his hidden fortune, escaped on a boat to South America, or, my personal favorite, even traveled to London. It was actually the real Jack the Ripper.
Which is complete, utter garbage from a timeline perspective.
Oh, entirely.
But those myths persisted in the public consciousness for over a century. People just love a supervillain survival story.
Finally, in 2017, anthropologists from the Penn Museum, led by a brilliant researcher named Samantha Cox, officially exhumed his grave in Delaware County to settle these ridiculous rumors once and for all.
And the forensic reality of that 2017 exhumation is just incredible to read about. Because Holmes was so paranoid, he insisted on being buried in a concrete vault 10 feet down.
Right.
But what he didn't realize was that placing a concrete box that deep in that specific cemetery meant his grave sat below the natural water table.
So over the decades, groundwater seeped through the porous dirt and penetrated the concrete, completely flooding the coffin.
And this created a completely anaerobic environment.
For those unfamiliar with the term, an anaerobic environment means there is absolutely zero oxygen present. Normal decomposition requires oxygen for bacteria to break down tissue.
Without oxygen, the normal decay process halts entirely, and a chemical process called saponification occurs, creating a substance known as adipocere, or grave wax.
So when the researchers cracked the concrete open, expecting to find a clean skeleton, they found a nightmare. He had not decomposed normally at all.
His clothes, his leather boots, his bowler hat, they were perfectly preserved in the cold water. Even his creepy little mustache was still fully attached to his skull.
But because of the trapped, stagnant water, his internal organs, his brain, and his flesh had completely dissolved into this fetid, stinking sludge.
Yeah.
The anthropologists had to literally pump the toxic sludge out of the coffin with hoses just to reach the bones at the bottom.
They eventually retrieved the skull, tested the DNA extracted from his teeth, compared it directly to the DNA of his modern living descendants, and confirmed with absolute scientific certainty that the body dissolving in the concrete was Herman Webster Mudgett.
The escape myths were crushed forever. But the poetic justice of his burial is what really stands out to anyone studying the case.
It really is.
He was so terrified of losing control of his physical form after death that he engineered his own bizarre preservation chamber, and the direct result was his body turning into a vile, toxic soup trapped in a box.
That's just karma.
Pause for a second and ask yourself, what will you think about next time you walk past an old brick post office in your city? Because the Inglewood Post Office in Chicago currently sits right on the exact footprint where the murder castle used to be.
The basement where he hid the bodies is literally beneath the mail sorting room.
If you're watching on YouTube right now, let us know in the comments if you'd ever buy a stamp from that building, knowing what happened in the dirt beneath the floorboards.
When you look back at the entire exhausting scope of this case, from the medical school thefts to the Toronto basement, the final tragedy really comes down to the yellow journalism of the 1890s.
Yeah, the media absolutely played a huge role here.
The media of the era was so incredibly desperate to sell newspapers that they literally invented the secret gas chambers, the acid vats, and the entirely fabricated body count of 200 victims.
And in doing so, they inadvertently gave a pathetic, greedy, highly disorganized con man the legendary supervillain status that his narcissism so desperately craved in life.
Exactly. By focusing entirely on the myth of the monster, society almost lost the true, deeply human tragedy of his actual victims. People like Emmeline Sigran and Alice Nellie and Howard Pitezel, who were destroyed simply because they were in his way.
All right, if we made your drive, your workout, or your downtime even a little bit better today, do us a massive favor. Whether you are watching on YouTube, streaming on Spotify, listening on Apple Podcasts, or literally anywhere else, hit that follow or subscribe button right now. We drop episodes like this frequently, bringing you the most fascinating cases in the most interesting way possible. Lock in, because you do not want to miss the crazy mysteries we've queued up for next time. See you then.